The ship never came home, and when people searched for it, they found nothing but blood in the waves. The year was 1798, and a merchant ship known as the Providence set sail under a crimson dawn. The harbor smelled of salt and tar, the ropes creaking against the docks like whispers of warning. Families stood on the pier, waving goodbye, unaware they would never see their loved ones again. The Providence was built for glory, its hull reinforced for the Atlantic storms, its sails towering like cathedral windows against the morning sky. But to the men who crewed it, there was something unnatural about the voyage from the very beginning. They swore the sea birds circled lower that day, their cries sharper, almost like screams. By dusk, whispers spread through the taverns on shore. The ship carried more than cargo. Beneath crates of silks and barrels of spices was said to be a forbidden chest, an artifact stolen from ruins where even priests refused to walk. The locals called it cursed, and the sailors. They laughed nervously, pretending not to believe. But the ocean does not forgive laughter. Days later, fishermen along the coast reported something chilling. They spotted a slick of red water stretching across the horizon, thick as blood, glimmering under the moonlight. No wreckage, no sails, just silence and crimson foam licking at their boats. One fisherman swore he saw a hand rise from the waves, pale and grasping, before vanishing into the depths. The Providence was gone. No distress signals, no survivors, no remains. The ship had simply erased itself from the world. Or so people thought. Because a week later, on the night of a storm, villagers claimed they saw the Providence again, its lantern glowing faintly through the fog, its sails torn and ragged but sailing as if manned by shadows. The air smelled of brine and iron, the same stench that clings to a battlefield. Then, silence. The ship disappeared into the mist once more. Since then, sailors speak of the Providence in hushed tones. Some call it a ghost ship, others call it a warning. But all agree, it was no ordinary wreck. Something followed that ship into the water and something brought it back. And that was only the beginning. Backhand index pointing right. If you saw a ship appear in blood-red waters, would you sail toward it, or run? Comment below before the next reveal. Deep in the ship's cargo was something no sailor dared to touch. A chest the captain swore would never be opened. Captain Elias Harding was no ordinary sailor. He had survived storms that swallowed fleets, navigated waters where compasses spun wild, and carved his name into maritime legend. Yet those who served under him whispered that Harding's eyes held a shadow, as though he carried a burden far heavier than the ocean itself. That burden lay hidden in the cargo hold of the Providence. On the shipping manifest, it was listed as a simple iron chest. But the crew knew better. They noticed how Harding alone carried the key, how he forbade anyone from even touching the crate. He told them it was valuable trade, bound for noble hands across the sea. Yet his orders were laced with fear, not authority. One stormy night, curiosity outweighed obedience. A young deckhand, Samuel Briggs, swore he heard noises beneath the planks, a scratching sound, a pulse, as though something inside the chest wanted out. He crept down into the hold, lantern trembling in his grip, the smell of damp wood and rust filling his lungs. When he pressed his ear to the chest, he swore he heard breathing. Samuel staggered back, terrified, but before he could cry out, the captain appeared. His voice was low, trembling with rage. "You'll never open that chest. If you value your life, boy, you'll forget you ever heard it." But how could he forget? Soon the entire crew knew. They whispered of relics stolen from forgotten temples, idols carved in bone, treasures soaked in blood. Some claimed Harding had made a pact, trading men's souls for safe passage across cursed waters. Others believed the chest carried something far worse, not treasure, but a curse that clung to whoever possessed it. The men grew restless. Why risk their lives for riches they could never touch? Why carry a chest even the captain feared? Their loyalty cracked like rotting timber. Every creak of the ship felt like a warning, every gust of wind a whisper. throw it overboard. But Harding would not let go. He guarded the chest as though it were his own heart, and that choice would damn them all. Because the moment the chest crossed the ocean, the ship changed. Food spoiled overnight, compasses faltered, and the sea itself seemed to rise against them. The men began to wonder, was the storm chasing them, or summoned by the very thing they carried? Backhand index pointing right, if you were on that ship, would you open the chest or toss it into the sea? Comment now before the truth is revealed. What happened on her wedding night? The village couldn't ignore it anymore. Whispers of the cursed family spread through every dusty road, every candle-lit tavern. Young men who once dreamt of marrying into the family now trembled at the thought, and mothers warned their sons, a bride who vanishes is no blessing, but a curse made flesh. The third disappearance was the most haunting of all. This time the groom wasn't poor or powerless. He was a soldier, hardened by war, a man who laughed in the face of superstition. On the night of his wedding, he promised the villagers that if the curse were real, he'd break it with his bare hands. But when the morning sun spilled across the land, the soldier was found slumped in a chair, his sword still sheathed, and his bride was gone. No blood, no struggle, just silence. The villagers said the curse wasn't just repeating, it was feeding. Each disappearance left the family house darker, its halls colder, as if the walls themselves had swallowed the women whole. Was it a punishment for sins of the ancestors? Or had the family made a pact too terrible to name? By now, fear ruled the village more than faith. Priests were called. Superstitions were tested. Some swore they saw shadows moving in the windows of the cursed house, long after the family had fallen asleep. But one thing was certain, this curse wasn't dying, it was growing stronger. And as dread settled into every heart, one question echoed louder than all others. How long before the curse took someone beyond the family? A mother reveals the unthinkable. The disappearances had shaken the entire village, but what came next struck even deeper fear. For the first time, the matriarch of the cursed family, an old, grief-stricken woman, stepped forward with a confession no one was prepared to hear. Her voice cracked, her hands trembled, but her words carried the weight of generations. She revealed that the curse had not appeared out of nowhere. Long ago, her great-grandfather, desperate for wealth and prosperity, made a bargain in secret. A bargain not with heaven, but with something far darker. In exchange for riches, the family would be cursed to lose its daughters. Each wedding night, the entity would come to claim them, never leaving blood, never leaving a trace, only silence where laughter had once been. The villagers gasped. Many wanted to dismiss it as the ranting of a broken mother, but her eyes told the truth. They were hollow, haunted, and weary from decades of watching her daughters vanish one by one. She swore she had heard footsteps in the halls on those cursed nights, followed by whispers that did not belong to the living. The priest who heard her confession was shaken to his core. He urged her to repent, to seek forgiveness, but she shook her head. "Forgiveness cannot break chains forged in blood," she whispered. Her last words echoed through the room like a death knell. "The curse does not end with us. One day it will hunger for more than brides." Those who heard the confession fled the house, their faces pale with terror. The family was no longer seen as victims. They were carriers of a darkness that might one day consume the entire village. And for the first time, the people realized the curse was not merely a private tragedy. It was a shadow stretching over them all. The silence shattered into terror. The village had grown accustomed to the eerie quiet that followed each disappearance. But this time, silence was replaced with something far more horrifying: screams, blood-curdling, bone-chilling screams that tore through the night like knives cutting through fabric. It was the wedding of Eliza, the youngest daughter of the cursed family. The entire community had gathered, some out of joy, others out of morbid curiosity, wondering if this bride too would vanish without a trace. As the night deepened, the festivities slowed, and unease settled like a fog over the house. Then, without warning, a scream rang out. It wasn't the cry of a woman startled. It was the kind of scream that clawed its way into your chest and refused to let go. Guests rushed toward the bridal chamber, their footsteps echoing against the wooden floors. The door was locked from the inside. They pounded, shouted, prayed, but no answer came. Only the muffled, frantic shrieks that grew weaker with every second. Finally, the door splintered open. The chamber inside was lit by a single flickering candle, shadows dancing violently across the walls. The bed was empty. The bride was gone. Yet the air carried something new this time, an acrid stench like sulfur mixed with burnt wood, filling the nostrils of everyone inside. The screams had stopped, but the room pulsed with a dreadful energy, as though something unseen lingered, mocking their desperation. People stumbled back, some fainting, others vomiting. Never before had the curse revealed itself so audibly, so cruelly. The villagers whispered of demons, of unseen hands, dragging Eliza into the abyss. But others claimed they saw claw marks carved into the wooden floor, as though she had tried to hold on until her nails split and bled. That night, fear no longer belonged only to the cursed family. It spread through the entire village like wildfire. Doors were barred, candles were left burning until dawn, and mothers clutched their daughters as though evil itself roamed the streets. And for the first time, the curse had spoken, not with whispers, but with screams loud enough to awaken every soul within miles. A priest dares to defy fate. The village was trembling with fear after Eliza's horrifying screams vanished into silence. Doors stayed barred, prayers filled the night air, and whispers of leaving the cursed land spread like wildfire. But one man refused to accept that this was destiny, the village priest. Known for his stern faith, he believed no darkness could withstand the light of God. Yet deep in his heart, even he wondered if the curse was something older, something beyond his sacred texts. Desperate to save the village, the priest announced a ritual. It would take place inside the very house where the brides had vanished. The family hesitated, but the villagers, exhausted by terror, demanded it. On the appointed night, they gathered with trembling candles in their hands, forming a circle around the priest. The air was thick with incense, but beneath it lingered a strange, metallic tang, like blood on iron. Priest began his chants, his voice rising against the groaning wind outside. The wooden beams creaked, as though the house itself disapproved. Then, without warning, the flames of the candles bent inward toward the priest, as if pulled by an unseen force. Whispers filled the room, not the gentle murmur of prayer, but sharp, mocking voices speaking in tongues none could understand. Women fainted. Children cried. Still, the priest continued, sweat dripping from his brow as his hands trembled over the crucifix. Then came the smell. Sulfur, sharp and choking, spread through the chamber, so thick it burned the eyes and throat. The villagers coughed, some begging the priest to stop, but he pressed on until his voice faltered. His chanting broke into silence, and he staggered back, pale as death. The crucifix he held had grown ice cold, so cold it burned his skin, leaving blackened marks across his palms. The ritual ended in chaos. People fled the house, convinced they had angered whatever spirit had claimed the brides. The priest collapsed, muttering a single phrase that haunted everyone who heard it. "This curse is older than God." That night no one slept, for if even the priest could not face the darkness, who among them could? The curse was no longer just a family tragedy, it was a power beyond the reach of heaven itself. And the villagers began to wonder, had the priest's defiance made things worse? For the first time, a groom disappears. Until now, the curse had always taken the brides, young women who vanished into silence, leaving behind only grief. But the night of the vanishing groom shattered every expectation. It proved that the curse had no limits, and worse, it was evolving. The story begins with Thomas, a man known for his defiance. When he asked to marry into the cursed family, the villagers begged him not to. "You'll be next," they warned, but Thomas laughed at their superstitions. He believed strength and courage could break chains that fear had forged. The wedding was small, held in secret, almost as though the family hoped to trick the curse by hiding the ceremony. For a while it worked. That night the village was silent. No screams, no flickering lights, no sulfur in the air. People dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, the curse had ended. But as dawn crept in, the illusion shattered. The bride awoke to find the bed empty. Thomas was gone. His clothes were folded neatly on the chair, his boots still by the door. No signs of struggle, no screams in the night, only silence. Yet something about the room was wrong. The mirror above the fireplace, normally clear, had darkened like smoke-stained glass, and faintly in its reflection the bride swore she saw Thomas's face, not in flesh but trapped behind the glass, his mouth open in a silent scream. The villagers were horrified. Until then, they thought they understood the curse. The daughters would vanish, and the men were merely witnesses to tragedy. But Thomas's disappearance proved the curse was not bound by gender, age, or tradition. It was choosing freely now, feeding on whoever dared to challenge it. The priest, still weakened from his failed ritual, was asked what this meant. His reply was chilling. The curse is hungry. It is no longer satisfied with the brides. It is reaching out for more. His words spread dread across the land. Doors were locked tighter, prayers grew louder, and rumors whispered that the curse would not stop until it had consumed every soul in the family line. And yet, hidden beneath the fear was a darker question no one dared to ask aloud. If the curse could now take a groom, what would it demand next? The feast turned into a graveyard. After the vanishing of Thomas, fear twisted into obsession. Some villagers wanted to abandon the cursed family entirely, to let them rot in their despair. But others insisted that defiance was the only answer. If the curse struck at weddings, then they would hold one so large, so public, that the darkness itself would be forced into the light. So against every trembling instinct, another wedding was planned. This one wasn't hidden in shadows. Invitations were sent across villages, the feast prepared with roasted meats, sweet breads, and wine barrels enough to drown a town in celebration. Musicians were hired, candles lit across the estate, and laughter, though nervous, filled the air. For one night, they tried to silence centuries of fear with the noise of joy. But the silence came anyway. It began in the middle of the feast. The musicians played, their fiddles and drums beating loudly, when suddenly everything stopped. Not the people, no, the guests still moved, still raised glasses, still opened their mouths to speak. But not a sound emerged. No laughter, no music, no clinking of glasses. A wave of silence had fallen across the hall so suddenly, so completely, that even the crackle of the fire had vanished. People froze, confusion spreading like frost. They slapped the table, stomped their feet, screamed into the night. But the silence swallowed everything whole. Only their breathing remained, heavy and panicked, echoing louder than any song. The bride and groom stared at each other in terror, their lips moving in frantic prayer, but even their words were stolen away. Then came the smell, rotten, like damp earth freshly dug from a grave, seeping through the grand hall. The candles flickered violently, and one by one they extinguished, plunging the feast into darkness. When the last flame died, the silence shattered, not with screams but with a single, piercing laugh. A laugh no throat in the room had made. When the candles were relit, the bride was gone. Her chair sat empty, her veil left crumpled on the floor like shed skin. And worse, the wedding feast that had moments ago overflowed with food was now bare. Platters were empty, wine barrels drained. It was as if the curse had not only taken the bride but feasted with them, mocking their attempt to outwit it. The villagers fled that night, leaving the estate in ruins. And as they whispered in horror, a question clawed at their minds. If the curse could silence an entire room, how much further could it reach? Voices no one should ever hear. After the silent wedding feast, the cursed estate was abandoned. The villagers no longer dared to gather there, and the family itself locked every window and door, retreating into their own prison of fear. Yet, despite the silence of the house, something new began to stir. It wasn't screams, nor laughter, it was whispers. At first they came at night, faint murmurs behind the walls like dozens of voices speaking just beyond reach. The family dismissed it as grief and imagination, until one evening the youngest son pressed his ear against the plaster. His face went pale. "They're calling my name," he whispered. Soon others heard it too. Sometimes the whispers pleaded softly, begging to be let out. Other times they mocked, echoing the very words family members had spoken earlier that day, repeating their secrets with cruel precision. The house became a mirror of their own sins, each voice reflecting something buried, something shameful. The whispers spread beyond the house. Neighbors passing by at night swore they heard soft chanting leaking from the walls, though the shutters were sealed. A traveler, seeking shelter, fled after claiming he heard dozens of brides crying within the floorboards, their nails scratching for freedom. And always the smell accompanied it, that same metallic tang, like rusted chains soaked in old blood. The family tried to drown it out. They played music, prayed louder, even hammered at the walls to expose the source. But when they tore the plaster open, there was nothing. Only cold air and a sudden gust that extinguished every candle in the room. And in that moment of darkness, the whispers roared like a chorus of the damned. Worse still, the voices grew bolder. They began to whisper not only in the house, but in dreams. The matriarch awoke one night screaming that her dead daughters had surrounded her bed, whispering in her ears, their breath icy against her skin. The youngest son was found sleepwalking, his hands pressed against the walls as though he were trying to join the voices on the other side. By now, the villagers no longer spoke of the family as cursed. They spoke of the house itself as alive. A living tomb, feeding on the souls it had swallowed and calling for more. And in the dead of night, one question haunted all who heard the whispers. What happens when the voices finally answer back? A strange mark begins to spread. As the whispers grew louder, the curse took a new and horrifying shape. This time, leaving behind something physical, something that could no longer be dismissed as imagination. It began with the bride's brother. One morning he woke with a dark bruise across his chest, shaped like a handprint far too large to be human. At first, the family thought it an injury from his restless sleep, but the mark did not fade. Instead, it deepened, turning from blue to black as though ink had been pressed into his flesh. And every night, as the whispers crept through the walls, the mark pulsed faintly, like a beating heart under his skin. Soon, others bore the same affliction. A cousin discovered a ring-shaped scar around her wrist, as if shackled by unseen chains. The matriarch revealed a burn across her neck that appeared overnight, shaped like the very veil her daughters had worn before vanishing. Each mark carried a meaning, a symbol of how the curse bound itself to their bloodline. The villagers, horrified, began to avoid the family entirely. They whispered that the marks were not signs but signatures, the curse branding its chosen prey like cattle before the slaughter. Worse still, some claimed the marks glowed faintly in the dark, a sickly red light that illuminated the rooms at night like embers from a fire. The smell returned too, burnt flesh and sulfur filling the air whenever the marks flared. Dogs howled at the house, refusing to cross its threshold. Children, daring each other to peek through the shutters, screamed that they saw glowing shapes moving across the family's skin, twisting like serpents just beneath their flesh. Desperate, the family sought doctors, healers, even traveling scholars, but none could explain it. One scholar, trembling as he traced the bruise on the brother's chest, whispered, "This is no wound. This is a seal." When pressed to explain further, he fled the house before nightfall, muttering that he would not remain to see the seal completed. The family was left with terror carved into their very bodies, and with each passing night, the marks spread, crawling further across their skin like ink on parchment. But what chilled them most was not the pain, nor the horror. It was the whispers that now spoke clearly, almost joyfully, whenever a new mark appeared. One more chosen. The fire should have erased everything, so why did this one letter survive? The night the manor burned, screams were swallowed by crackling timber, and history itself seemed to crumble into smoke. Rooms that had stood for centuries collapsed into heaps of ash, portraits dissolved into flames, and every trace of the family's secrets should have been lost forever. But when the embers cooled, a single relic defied the inferno. A half-burned letter, its edges curled like blackened wings, its words still legible as if the fire itself had chosen to spare them. This letter, written in a trembling hand, carried a confession no one was meant to see. It spoke of betrayal, of blood spilled in rage, and of Evelyn's silence in the face of a crime she could never cleanse. The signature, barely visible, belonged not to Evelyn but to her own brother. In that instant the curse shifted shape. Maybe Evelyn had not been the executioner but the witness, chained to her brother's guilt. Yet if she was innocent, why had she gone to her grave with lips sealed and eyes haunted? But here's the twist that unsettled everyone who touched the fragile page. Each person who handled the letter, curators, historians, even family descendants, suffered sudden misfortunes. Illnesses struck without warning, accidents unfolded in impossible ways, and entire fortunes drained overnight. Some swore they could smell smoke whenever the letter was near. Others heard faint scratching at night, as if the paper itself was whispering to be read again. It wasn't just ink and parchment. It was a curse in physical form. The most chilling line sat at the very bottom of the page, scrawled in frantic strokes. "The house will not forgive. It will take its due." That sentence alone turned the letter from evidence into prophecy, and in the years following its discovery, the prophecy seemed to live on. Each new reader was dragged into the same cycle of ruin, just as the family had been for generations. So now the question lingers like smoke in the ruins. Why did this one letter survive the flames? Was it a cruel trick of wind and fire, or was it the house itself, ensuring the truth could never be buried, no matter how much ash tried to cover it? What if a door appears in your house, but no one remembers building it? When the manor's ruins were rebuilt into a museum, workers uncovered something that shouldn't have been there. A sealed door hidden behind a wall of bricks, untouched by fire. Its frame was iron, its surface warped with rust, and strange claw-like scratches scored deep into the wood, as if something inside had once fought to escape. No record of its existence appeared in the house's original blueprints. According to the archives, that part of the estate was supposed to be solid stone. So why was there a locked room? The first twist came when the door was finally forced open. Inside was a chamber no larger than a prison cell. The air was stale, choking with the stench of rot and mildew, and the walls were streaked with what looked like soot, or was it dried blood? In the corner stood a single chair, bolted to the floor, with leather straps hanging limp at its sides. A journal lay nearby, pages warped by dampness but still legible. The entries were short, frantic, and always written in the same shaky hand. "It comes at night, the sound of the sea inside the walls. Do not sleep." The writing grew more chaotic with each page, until the words dissolved into jagged lines and desperate scratches. Who had written them? And why had they been kept in such a room? Here's the second twist. When researchers took photographs of the chamber, the images showed something the eye could not see. Behind the chair, a faint outline appeared in the pictures, a figure, tall and shadowed, looming as if it had been waiting. The figure didn't vanish with later photos. In fact, the closer the team returned to study the room, the clearer the outline became. Locals whispered that this hidden cell wasn't for imprisoning people at all, but for containing something else. Something the family had trapped when Evelyn's curse began, hoping to keep it locked away forever. Yet the journal suggested the truth was far worse. Whatever haunted the room hadn't been kept out, it had been kept in. The final line of the journal, smeared in ink and almost unreadable, left chills that lingered long after the discovery. "If the door is opened, the sea will take us all." How does seawater flood a room miles from the coast? Weeks after the hidden chamber was uncovered, something even stranger began to happen. The stone floor inside the room, sealed for centuries, was suddenly damp as though waves had licked across it. The smell of salt and decay filled the air, sharp and suffocating, identical to the reek of a rotting pier. But here's the impossible part. The manor sat more than 20 miles inland. No flood, no storm, and no underground stream could explain seawater dripping from cracks in the wall. The first twist came when lab tests were run on the moisture. Scientists expected ordinary groundwater. Instead, they found high concentrations of salt and strange organic residue, microscopic traces of fish scales, barnacles, and even fragments of coral. It was seawater pulled straight from the ocean. But how had it seeped into a locked room buried in the countryside? The second twist was more terrifying. Late one night, a security guard reported hearing a low, rhythmic sound echoing from the chamber, the unmistakable crash of waves. When he entered, the air was freezing and faint droplets clung to the ceiling. He swore he heard something moving in the walls, like heavy breathing, before the sound vanished. Days later, that same guard quit without notice, muttering only, "The sea followed me home." This is where the modern parallel strikes. Families today guard their secrets with digital walls, hidden offshore accounts, and sealed documents. Yet just like the locked chamber, the truth always leaks through. Think of scandals where private files, leaked emails, or hidden recordings suddenly surface, exposing corruption. Just as seawater forced its way inland, so too do secrets burst free, no matter how far you bury them. And then came the chilling final detail. The journal found in the room, once thought finished, had more pages glued together at the back. When carefully separated, they revealed the last message scrawled in fading ink. "The tide is rising. Soon the ship will return." But what ship? And how could it return to a place where no ocean should exist? What if a ship sails where there's no water? One stormy night, villagers living near the manor reported something they could never explain. Across the open fields, land that should have been nothing but wet earth and grass, they saw a ship drifting silently through the fog. Its sails were tattered, its masts splintered, and its lanterns glowed with a sickly green light. The vessel didn't move on water but floated as if the land itself had turned into a black ocean. By morning, the ground was dry again, as if nothing had passed at all. The first twist came when researchers compared eyewitness accounts. Every villager described the same haunting detail. The ship bore a figurehead of a woman, carved with a face twisted in anguish. When sketches were shown to the family's descendants, their blood ran cold. The figurehead looked identical to Evelyn, but how could her likeness be on a ship built centuries earlier? Second twist deepened the nightmare. Old shipping records uncovered in a coastal archive revealed a vessel called the Seraphine, which vanished without a trace in 1783. Its final manifest included a cargo of religious relics and something cryptically described as the bound spirit. That line had been scratched out in every surviving copy of the record, as though someone tried to erase it. Yet the date of the disappearance matched the very year Evelyn's curse began to plague the family estate. Sensory details only made the sightings worse. Witnesses swore they could hear the groan of rigging above the manor fields, smell salt spray carried on the wind, and feel the vibration of waves beneath their feet. Horses bolted in terror, dogs refused to go outside, and one farmer dropped dead on the spot after whispering, "They've come to take her back." Here's the modern parallel. Even today, vanished ships like Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 haunt us. Technology advances, but we are still powerless against mysteries that vanish into the fog. Just like the Seraphine, the unanswered questions become a curse of their own, consuming families with paranoia, grief, and suspicion. The final sting of Section 14. A charred scrap of driftwood was found on the manor grounds the morning after the sightings. Carved into its surface were words no one could deny. "The sea remembers." Would you step aboard a ship that never returned? The cursed heart of this mystery beats in the story of the Seraphine, a merchant vessel that set sail in 1783 on what should have been a routine voyage. Its mission was simple: transport fine goods, religious relics, and passengers of influence across the Atlantic. But from the very first day at sea, the ship seemed doomed. Sailors wrote in their logs of a strange silence that clung to the horizon. No gulls circled the masts, no waves broke against the hull. The ocean stretched flat and endless, like a sheet of black glass. The first twist came weeks into the voyage. Survivors, at least those who made it to port before vanishing themselves, spoke of whispers echoing across the deck at night. The voices didn't belong to the crew. They came from below, rising up through the planks, muttering in languages none of the sailors could understand. Some swore they saw wet footprints on the upper deck in the dead of night, even though every man was accounted for. The second twist came when the captain's journal was uncovered centuries later. Its last intact entry was chillingly precise. "We carry not only cargo but something chained. It sings when the sea grows restless. The men are afraid. I fear we have taken on more than goods." After this entry, the pages were smeared with salt stains, as though the journal itself had drowned before ever reaching land. Sensory horror deepened as the voyage continued. Crewmen described the stench of rotting kelp, even in the middle of open waters. Lantern flames burned blue instead of gold, casting sickly shadows across the sails. One sailor claimed the figurehead. The carved woman at the ship's bow moved her mouth as if she were gasping for air. Another said she wept tears of salt water whenever the storm clouds gathered. Those who mocked the sightings didn't live long. 3 men were swept overboard in calm seas, their screams swallowed instantly, leaving no splash. Here's the modern parallel. When planes vanish or ships sink today, governments scramble to control the narrative. Passengers reduced to statistics, flight data erased, grieving families kept in the dark. The Seraphine feels eerily familiar, a centuries-old MH370, a disappearance wrapped in silence, with whispers that someone wanted the truth buried. The last official sighting of the Seraphine came from a lighthouse keeper on the coast of Ireland. He described the vessel sailing straight into a violent storm, but what terrified him most was not the ship itself. He claimed a woman stood at its bow, arms outstretched, hair whipping in the wind, staring straight toward the land as if she were searching for someone. Days later, wreckage began washing ashore. Broken planks, splintered crates, and a single waterlogged trunk bearing the family crest later found at the manor. Inside was nothing but seawater and a note, almost dissolved. "She will not rest until all return." No bodies were ever found. Not one. The entire crew of the Seraphine simply vanished, swallowed by the storm or something far worse. What if the wreck didn't end at sea, but followed the family home? When fragments of the Seraphine washed ashore, they carried more than splintered wood and waterlogged crates. They carried a curse. The family that had financed the voyage, Eveline's bloodline, was summoned to claim what was left. What they found was not cargo, but a nightmare that clung to every object touched by salt. The first twist came when the trunk bearing the family crest was opened. Instead of valuables, it contained seawater so black it shimmered like oil. No one could explain how it stayed contained, sloshing endlessly even when the trunk was emptied. Worse, the moment the chest was brought into the manor, servants whispered of footsteps echoing in the halls at night, dripping as though someone walked with water-soaked shoes. Soon after, portraits of ancestors began warping, their painted eyes swollen with moisture, paint peeling as though they were drowning within the canvas. The second twist was even more chilling. Within days of the wreckage's arrival, family members reported waking in the night to the sound of waves crashing against their bedroom walls. Windows rattled with invisible gusts, floors trembled as if tides lapped against them. One heir claimed he woke with seaweed tangled around his legs, though he had not left his bed. Another swore salt water poured from his mouth when he tried to scream. And then came the unexplainable deaths. A cousin, healthy and strong, was found lifeless in his study, his lungs filled with seawater. The manor was miles from the coast. Doctors called it impossible, yet the smell of brine clung to his body for days. Servants fled, whispering that the ship had not sunk. It had simply changed course, moving from the ocean to the bloodline itself. Here's the modern parallel. Dynasties today inherit not only wealth, but scandals and curses of reputation. Just as the family could not escape the sea that followed them inland, modern families cannot escape the digital tide of leaked secrets. scandals, and betrayals that resurface again and again. What the ocean claimed for Evelyn's bloodline, social ruin now claims for modern empires. The sensory horrors grew unbearable. The manor itself began to change. Wooden beams dripped with condensation, the smell of rot thickened in the halls, and a low groaning sound, like a ship's hull straining against waves, echoed through its foundations. Guests who entered swore the wallpaper swelled like wet parchment, and one visitor fainted after seeing barnacles forming along the grand staircase. The final cliffhanger came with a diary entry from the matriarch of the family. In shaky ink she wrote, "The sea has moved into our house. We are drowning, but the water is not real. It waits for us in our sleep. Evelyn walks with the tide." The wreck hadn't ended in the ocean. It had come ashore, and the family's curse was only beginning. What if the dead returned, not to comfort but to condemn? It began with whispers. At first, the family thought it was the creaking of the manor's soaked beams, or the groan of floorboards warped by dampness. But the whispers grew louder, carrying Evelyn's name through the darkened corridors. Servants swore they heard a woman's voice humming a lullaby, always ending in a sharp gasp, as though drowning mid-song. The first twist came one stormy night when a maid entered the east wing and never returned. When the family searched, they found her apron floating in a puddle of salt water that hadn't been there moments earlier. No body was ever discovered, yet her footprints, wet and bare, trailed across the stone floor, leading into a locked room that had not been opened in decades. When the door was forced, the room was empty, except for the sound of waves echoing from its walls. The second twist deepened when family members themselves began encountering her. One heir woke to find Evelyn's reflection staring from his mirror, her face pale, lips blue, and strands of seaweed tangled in her hair. Another swore he saw her standing at the foot of his bed, water dripping from her dress onto the floor. When he blinked, she was gone, but the sheets were soaked through, as if she had just risen from the sea. Sensory horrors escalated. Windows fogged with condensation even in summer. The air smelled perpetually of brine, thick and suffocating. Doors swelled shut as though the wood itself had absorbed the tide. At midnight, the sound of sails snapping in phantom winds filled the manor, though no ship was near. Sometimes on the staircase, guests reported hearing Evelyn's wet footsteps behind them, soft at first, then splashing louder until they turned to look, only to find no one there. Here's the modern parallel. In today's world, ghosts take the form of scandals, resurfacing long after people think they're buried. Just like Evelyn's spirit haunting her descendants, leaked footage, secrets, and past sins return to shatter reputations. Families cannot escape the shadows of the dead, whether in 1783 or in the digital age. The climax came when a dinner guest, mocking the legend, raised his glass and toasted, "To Evelyn, may she rest at last." Moments later, the candles flickered out, plunging the room into darkness. When they relit, his chair was empty. The floor beneath him was soaked, salt water pooling where he had sat. His body was never recovered. The family diary records the terror of that night in one single line. "She walks with the tide, and none can escape her grasp." The haunting had begun. Evelyn was no longer a story whispered in fear. She was a presence, wet and relentless, reclaiming her place in the house. What if Evelyn wasn't the ghost, but the jailer of something far darker? As Evelyn's ghostly presence grew undeniable, historians digging through the family archives uncovered a troubling clue, the captain's journal from the Seraphine, describing the chained spirit. At first, scholars assumed this referred to Evelyn herself, that her soul had been bound to the ship after her betrayal. But deeper analysis suggested a more sinister possibility. Evelyn might not have been the prisoner at all. She may have been the warden. The first twist emerged in a hidden letter between two priests who had blessed the Seraphine before its voyage. They wrote that a relic, an artifact confiscated from a heretical sect, was loaded onto the ship under armed guard. The priests referred to it only as the vessel of grief. Their warning was chilling. It must never be opened. To unchain sorrow is to drown the living. But if that artifact made it aboard, and if it somehow merged with Evelyn's fate, the family had not just inherited a curse, they had inherited a prison. The second twist grew darker when the family's matriarch recorded her dreams in the weeks after the wreckage arrived. She described Evelyn standing at her bedside, pleading, not threatening, but begging for help. Evelyn whispered, "It isn't me. I keep it back. When I falter, the tide comes closer." Was Evelyn truly the vengeful ghost dragging her family into ruin, or was she the only barrier keeping the chained spirit from breaking free entirely? The sensory horrors reinforced this theory. During storms, witnesses claimed to see Evelyn's form at the manor's windows, staring outward, her hands pressed against the glass as though holding something back. In the cellar, water levels would rise and fall with no natural explanation, carrying faint groans that were not hers, a deep guttural resonance, as though the sea itself had a voice. One visitor swore he heard chains dragging across the floorboards, though no one else was present. Here's the modern parallel. Families, governments, even corporations often hide dark truths behind a single scapegoat. One name is blamed, one face takes the fall, while the true corruption lies deeper. Just as Evelyn was remembered as the ghostly curse, perhaps history painted her as the villain to obscure something darker, the entity she fought to contain. The chilling cliffhanger. A newly translated page from the captain's log revealed a final command scrawled in panic. If Evelyn falls, the sea will rise, and no shore will be spared. Evelyn's ghost may not have been the curse at all. She might have been humanity's last defense, and the family's punishment was the price of keeping that chained spirit sealed. What cursed object was powerful enough to sink a ship and haunt a bloodline? The priest's letters spoke of it in whispers, the vessel of grief. No description, no origin, only a warning. It must never be opened. For years, this cryptic phrase baffled historians. But when fragments of the seraphim were recovered, among them was an object wrapped in lead-lined casing, impossible to corrode even after decades beneath salt water. When researchers finally pried it open, what they found inside was not treasure, nor gold, nor holy relic. It was a small urn of black stone, polished smooth, carved with spirals that seemed to shift when stared at too long. Legends quickly rose around the urn. Some said it was carved from a meteorite that fell during a lunar eclipse, carried by a sect of monks who believed sorrow itself could be harvested, stored, and weaponized. Others argued it was far older, a relic of Babylon meant to capture the collective grief of a slaughtered people. Whatever its origin, the vessel was designed to contain, not unleash. And if Evelyn's spirit had become entangled with it, her curse may have been less about vengeance and more about guardianship. Witness accounts from the wreck's investigators are chilling. Those who handled the urn reported overwhelming despair within hours. One soldier claimed he saw visions of his dead mother weeping in the waves. Another was driven to madness, attempting to drown himself in the very harbor where the relic was kept. Even priests, men of faith hardened by exorcisms and rites, begged to have the object destroyed. Yet it was not destroyed. Instead, it was quietly transported to the family manor, sealed in the cellar, where the tragedies soon multiplied. This decision explains much. The flooding cellar, the moans during storms, Evelyn's ghost appearing not to harm but to warn. The family was cursed not simply because of Evelyn's betrayal, but because they became the unwilling custodians of an artifact no mortal hand should have touched. The curse was the vessel's hunger, feeding on grief, spreading despair, demanding fresh tragedy to sustain its silence. And here lies the sinister brilliance of the artifact. It did not simply bring death. It amplified sorrow, ensuring each loss in the family was felt like a wound that would never close. Generations were not only doomed to misfortune, they were enslaved to grief itself. Evelyn may have been trying in death to contain it, but with every falter, with every drowned child or broken vow, the vessel's influence seeped further into the world. The cliffhanger, a note hidden in the captain's log, revealed one final warning scratched in desperation. The urn is not full, it feeds still. When it overflows, the sea will not stop. If that urn still exists, and some claim it does, it is no longer just the family's curse. It may be humanity's ticking time bomb. What happens when even fire refuses to destroy the cursed? They thought fire would be their salvation. In the dead of night, 3 family members dragged the black urn into the courtyard, dousing it with oil and stacking it atop a pyre built from oak and salt-soaked straw. As the flames roared higher, villagers gathered, crossing themselves, whispering prayers, certain this ritual would end the nightmare once and for all. But as the urn was swallowed by fire, the first sign of something unnatural appeared. The flames turned from gold to a sickly green, burning lower, colder, until the entire pyre crackled with frost. Instead of cracking, instead of shattering, the vessel glowed faintly, as if feeding on the fire itself. When dawn came, the pyre was nothing but ash, but the urn remained untouched, resting calmly among the cinders, colder than the morning air. That was the first failure. The second was far worse. Every villager who had dared witness the attempted destruction suffered tragedy within a month. One drowned in shallow water. Another threw herself from a bell tower, whispering Evelyn's name. A priest who blessed the fire was found days later with his throat torn open, though no human hand was ever blamed. It was as if the urn had marked them, punishing any who defied its hunger. The family tried other means. Hammers shattered, saws dulled. Even gunpowder packed against its surface produced no fracture, only a low, resonant hum like a heartbeat echoing from deep within the stone. Some claimed they saw faces in the spirals as they struck it, eyes staring back, mouths silently screaming. It was no longer just an artifact. It had become a prison, and every attempt to destroy it only deepened its hold on those who tried. The twist came when one family member, desperate, attempted not to destroy but to open the urn. The lid shifted slightly, releasing a single wisp of smoke. It was enough to drop the man instantly to his knees, sobbing as though he had lost everyone he ever loved. He clawed at his own skin, begging forgiveness for sins he never confessed until others dragged him away. The urn sealed itself again with a hiss like steam. From that day forward, the family knew the vessel was not meant to be destroyed. It was meant to be endured. But endurance has limits. With each generation, the family weakened. Eveline's ghost screamed louder in the storms. The manor groaned with invisible pressure. The sea itself seemed restless, as though waiting for the vessel's final crack. And in the diaries of one doomed heir lies the most chilling line of all. We tried to kill it with fire, but now I fear it will kill us with water. What if the very sea turned against you? For years, the family believed Eveline's spirit was bound to storms, to fire, to wind. But they were wrong. The sea, calm, vast, merciless, was her truest weapon. It began quietly. First, the tide pulled back farther than usual, exposing jagged rocks no villager had ever seen before. Fishermen swore the ocean floor itself seemed rearranged, like something beneath the waves had shifted. Then the waves returned with twice the force, snapping masts, swallowing boats, and dragging whole crews down. At first, the villagers cursed bad luck. But when the bodies returned, waterlogged, eyes open, lips mouthing Eveline's name, they understood this was no accident. Inside the manor, the family heard the sea differently now. At night, the tide didn't sound like waves. It sounded like knuckles rapping against glass. Sometimes like a woman's breath pressed to the walls. One heir recorded that he could smell brine in his sheets, taste salt on his tongue, even when he hadn't stepped outside. The curse had expanded. The sea was no longer outside their home. It had seeped into their very lungs. Here's the first twist. One child disappeared while playing near the shoreline, but when they searched, her footprint stopped just before the water. Villagers swore they saw pale hands reach up from the surf, pulling her under without a sound. No splash. No scream, just silence. And when the tide returned, her small shoe washed ashore, perfectly dry. The second twist was crueler. A wedding had been planned to heal the family name, to bring light into the manor's shadow. But as the ceremony began, the church bell tolled out of rhythm. By the time guests rushed to the cliffside, the groom was gone, dragged into the sea, though the tide was low. His bride swore she saw Eveline's ghost in the foam, her veil streaming like kelp, her voice whispering, "The sea is mine, and now so is he." Each death, each drowning felt intentional, like Eveline was choosing plucking lives from the shore as payment. The villagers began avoiding the coast entirely. They let their boats rot, abandoned their trade, even starved rather than fish the cursed waters. But the family could not leave. The sea would not let them. Every attempt to sail away ended in wreckage, sails shredded, hulls split open, survivors dragged back to shore half dead. One surviving diary entry captures the despair best. "We are prisoners in our own home, not by stone, not by walls, but by the water itself. For when the sea calls your name, you do not run, you drown." The cliffhanger. Rumors began to spread that Eveline was not the only ghost waiting in those waves, that the urn had birthed something else in the deep. What if the ghost you feared wasn't the only one? For decades, everyone believed Eveline's wrath was singular. One ghost, one curse, one restless bride haunting her bloodline. But then the sea began to speak, and its voice was not hers. The first sign came during a storm so violent it split the cliffside apart. Witnesses swore they heard two voices in the wind, Eveline's high, furious scream, and a deeper, guttural chant rising from the waves. At first, they thought it was thunder. But when the storm broke, fishermen reported the sound continued, rolling beneath the ocean like a drumbeat, echoing against the rocks as though something massive moved just out of sight. Here's the chilling twist. Eveline had drowned on her wedding night, yes, but she had not drowned alone. Records uncovered by a priest revealed that the shipwreck carrying her dowry had sunk with nearly 50 sailors and servants trapped below deck. Their bodies were never recovered. Their souls, bound to the same tragedy, may have fused into something darker, a collective hunger. Eveline's ghost was the face, the voice of rage, but beneath her floated a legion of the forgotten dead. The family began hearing them first. At night, walls trembled with low groans, not like wood straining but like men gasping for air. One heir swore he saw wet handprints streaking across the windows, too large, too many to belong to any single person. In the cellar, water dripped without source, forming puddles that rippled, as if something below was trying to break through. The villagers witnessed horrors too. Nets pulled from the water came back shredded, not cut, but chewed. Whole schools of fish disappeared, replaced by bloated limbs tangled in seaweed. Sometimes, when the waves receded, faces appeared in the foam. Not Eveline's beautiful, vengeful face, but warped, distorted visages with eyes too wide and mouths locked in eternal screams. Then came the misdirection. A sailor claimed to have survived an encounter, dragged under by pale arms. He insisted Eveline spared him, whispering, "Not you, not yet." For a moment they thought she had grown merciful. But 2 days later his ship was found drifting empty, sails torn, the deck slick with seawater and blood. His body was never recovered. The family finally understood. Eveline was not their only tormentor. She was the door. Her fury had cracked open a channel between the living and the drowned. And now the others, those nameless, forgotten souls, were clawing to be remembered, to be fed, to be avenged. The cliffhanger. The diary's whisper of one final, horrifying suspicion, that the urn itself was never meant to hold Eveline alone, but an entire army of the drowned, waiting for release. What if the ocean itself came knocking on your door? It was supposed to be an ordinary storm. The family had weathered hundreds, but this night was different. The sea refused to stay where it belonged. The first wave struck without warning, crashing higher than the cliffs, spraying salt water against the manor's windows. At first, they thought it was wind-driven rain. But when they lit candles, the droplets running down the glass weren't rain. They were thick with sand and strands of seaweed. By midnight, the tide had risen so far it pounded against the doors, flooding the lower floors. Yet the tide tables said the sea should have been half a mile away. Here's the first twist. The waves didn't just bring water. They brought voices. Every crash carried moans, groans, whispers. One heir swore he heard Eveline calling his name, sweet and broken, as if begging him to step outside. Another claimed he heard dozens of voices, all chanting in unison, echoing like a funeral hymn. When they pressed their ears to the floor, the boards themselves vibrated with the rhythm of drowning lungs. The second twist came when the sea began to rise inside the house. Water bubbled up through the cracks in the stone cellar, creeping along the floors as though pulled by invisible hands. Salt crystals formed on furniture, mirrors fogged with brine, and the smell of rotting fish filled every room. In one hallway, a portrait of Evelyn's wedding day began dripping, not paint, but seawater, leaking from her eyes as though she were weeping. Panic erupted. The family tried barricading the doors, hauling buckets to throw water out, but every effort only made it worse. The more they resisted, the faster the water rose. One servant fled into the storm, but when lightning flashed, the family saw him swept into the air, not by wind, but by dozens of pale arms clawing from the sea. His screams echoed until swallowed by the waves. The villagers watching from the cliffs swore they saw something impossible, the ocean itself climbing, not crashing upward, not spraying, but climbing, scaling the rock face. Like a living creature, dragging itself toward the manor with the weight of all the drowned souls beneath it. And then the misdirection. Just as the manor seemed doomed to sink, the sea stopped. The waters receded in minutes, leaving behind only damp floors, overturned furniture, and the stench of rot. For a moment the family thought they were spared, but when they looked to the horizon, they saw shapes moving in the waves, too many to count. Figures half hidden in the foam, standing tall against the rising sun, watching. The cliffhanger. The ocean hadn't failed to take them that night. It was only waiting for the right tide, one that would never recede. What if you ran from the sea, only to find it waiting for you? After the night the sea climbed the walls, the family made a desperate choice: abandon the manor. For centuries the cliffs had been their prison, but now it seemed their grave. They packed in haste, carrying the urn and a few valuables, fleeing inland as dawn painted the horizon blood-red. Villagers watched in silence, crossing themselves, whispering, "The curse goes with them." At first the escape felt like salvation. The air grew drier, the salt faded from their tongues, and the crash of the waves grew faint. But unease soon replaced relief. Though they had traveled miles inland, the smell of brine lingered. Their clothes remained damp, and at night they swore they could still hear the sea, faint but steady, like a heartbeat, pulsing through the ground beneath their feet. Here's the first twist. When they reached a neighboring village, the wells turned salty overnight. Horses refused to drink, crops withered in the fields, and fish carcasses washed up in places where no river ran. Locals, furious, accused the family of carrying their curse into innocent lands. Stones were thrown, doors barred, prayers muttered as the family moved on like exiles. The second twist was crueler. One child, barely 8, was found sleepwalking in the middle of the night. When they followed her, she walked straight to a dry field, stopped, and began digging with her bare hands. Within minutes, water gushed from the earth, flooding the soil until it stank of rot and salt. The child awoke screaming, her mouth full of seawater she had never swallowed. And then the misdirection. They thought moving farther inland would weaken the curse. But the deeper they traveled, the stronger it grew. In forests, trees dripped with salt water despite no rain. In taverns, mugs of ale turned briny mid-sip. Travelers on the road swore they saw shadows of ships gliding silently across meadows at night, sails flapping without wind. The final blow came when they sought refuge in a monastery. The monks welcomed them, believing prayer could break what the sea had bound. But at midnight, the bells tolled without hands to pull them. The chapel flooded ankle-deep with freezing brine, and on the altar where candles should have burned, seafoam frothed and hissed, spelling a single word in bubbles: mine. The family realized too late. The curse was not tied to the manor, nor the cliffs, nor even the coast. It was tied to them. The urn had bound their bloodline to the drowned, and no distance from the ocean could sever that tether. The cliffhanger. Villagers swore that when the family fled inland, the sea itself began to rise, creeping farther each year, as if pursuing its chosen prey. What if the object that cursed you could never die? Driven inland, hunted by whispers and saltwater visions, the family reached their breaking point. The urn, the vessel that had haunted them for generations, was carried to an abandoned quarry at the edge of the forest. No priests, no villagers, only the cursed bloodline and the artifact that had become their doom. Their plan was simple: shatter it once and for all, but nothing about this curse was ever simple. They tried brute force first. Hammers rang against the stone, sparks flying, yet the urn did not crack. The blows echoed unnaturally, reverberating like bells underwater. One heir swore he heard laughter in the ringing, as though Eveline herself mocked their struggle. Here's the first twist. Fire failed before, but they tried it again, this time with pitch and resin piling wood until flames shot skyward. The urn glowed faintly, then dimmed, the fire dying faster than it should have, leaving nothing but a bitter smell, salt and rot, as though the ocean had smothered the flames with its breath. The second twist was worse. In desperation, they turned to ritual. An old monk had whispered of a rite, blood for freedom. The family cut their palms, dripping blood over the urn as they chanted prayers warped into curses. For a moment it seemed to work. The urn vibrated violently, its lid rattling, hairline fractures crawling across its surface. But then the fractures sealed themselves. The blood they had offered seeped inside, feeding it, strengthening it. From within, a sound emerged. Not a scream, not a moan, but a wet, rattling gasp, as though dozens of lungs were inhaling for the first time. Then came the misdirection. The family thought they had weakened it. For 3 nights afterward the haunting stopped. No salt water in their beds, no whispers, no storms. For the first time in years they slept. But on the 4th night the silence broke. The youngest heir awoke screaming, seawater pouring from her mouth, flooding her bed until she drowned in her sleep. The urn, hidden away in the cellar, was dripping, not with blood but with brine. The survivors realized the truth too late. Every attempt to destroy the urn only fed it. Fire, iron, even sacrifice. It absorbed their defiance and grew stronger. The cracks they thought were victories were only its way of drinking deeper. The cliffhanger. In the final diary entry of that generation, a single chilling line remains. We do not destroy the urn, we only teach it to hunger. What if your neighbors decided you were the curse? For generations, the family had suffered Eveline's wrath in silence. But after the failed destruction of the urn, the curse no longer struck only their bloodline. Wells spoiled, fields drowned, and inland villages awoke to dead fish littering their streets. Whispers spread like wildfire. The family had brought the sea with them. Fear turned to anger, and anger sharpened into vengeance. The first signs of revolt came at night. Villagers left dead animals at the family's doorstep, goats, chickens, even dogs, each throat slit, each body crusted with salt. Then came fire. Torches hurled against the manor's shutters, not to kill the family outright, but to drive them out, to force them into the open. Every door the family barred was hammered with fists, every prayer drowned out by the mob's chant. Burn the cursed, burn the sea walkers. Here's the first twist. The villagers demanded the urn. They believed destroying it in their own way, burning it in the town square, burying it in consecrated ground, would sever the curse. But when the family hesitated, clutching the urn as if it were both enemy and lifeline, the crowd's fury boiled over. One heir was dragged into the square, accused of harboring the devil's bride, and drowned in a trough of water while the mob screamed Eveline's name. When they pulled him up, his lungs were full of brine, not fresh water. The second twist came when the mob tried to seize the urn. They pried it from the family's hands, hauling it to the center of town, piling kindling around it. The fire roared high, but then, just as before, the flames died unnaturally fast. The air turned icy, the villagers' breath fogging even in the summer heat. Then came the sound, not the urn cracking, but dozens of voices rising in a watery chorus, whispering curses in a tongue no one recognized. Children fainted, livestock collapsed, and the bravest men stumbled back, dropping their torches as if the urn itself had scorched their souls. Then came the misdirection. The villagers thought they had won when the urn fell silent, the fire reduced to glowing ash. For a heartbeat, relief swept the crowd. But then the ground trembled. Water gushed from the ashes, flooding the square ankle-deep, carrying with it dead fish, broken shells, and bones, human bones bleached white. The villagers screamed, scattering into the night. When the flood receded minutes later, the urn sat in the mud, untouched. The family retrieved it in silence. They were no longer victims in the villagers' eyes. They were pariahs, untouchable, cursed beyond redemption. The mob dared not kill them now, but no door would open to them again. The cliffhanger. On the edge of the square, someone carved a warning into the stone with shaking hands. The sea is not outside, the sea is in them. What if a painting revealed a family member who never lived? In the late 1800s, a painting surfaced in the Holloway mansion that no one in the family could explain. It wasn't commissioned, nor did anyone recognize the face staring out from the canvas. Yet there it was, hung in the parlor overnight as if it had always belonged. The portrait showed a young woman in a wedding dress, eyes dark and hollow, her expression frozen in a half-smile that unsettled every guest who entered. The problem: the Holloways never had such a bride in their family tree. At first they assumed it was some long-forgotten ancestor, maybe painted by a traveling artist. But when genealogical records were checked, nothing, no trace, no name, no existence. And yet the figure in the painting bore an eerie resemblance to each generation's eldest daughter, almost like a phantom twin erased from history. Some whispered she was a child who had died at birth, painted in remembrance. Others claimed she never lived at all, merely a shadow of someone who should have been born. But the strangest part, the portrait seemed to change over time. Guests swore her eyes followed them around the room. A family maid refused to dust it after claiming the bride's veil shifted positions between mornings. Even more chilling, each time a Holloway daughter prepared to marry, the figure in the painting appeared younger, fresher, as if feeding off their joy or preparing to take their place. When one bride mysteriously vanished the night before her wedding, attention turned back to the cursed portrait. Had the missing woman been claimed by the phantom twin? Or was the family itself hiding something far darker? The Holloways locked the painting away in the attic, but some say it never stayed locked for long. Guests would report hearing scratching from behind the door, and once the canvas was found back in the parlor, its glass cracked as though someone had tried to break free. The Holloway family never spoke of it publicly again. But if you visit the town museum today, there's a portrait with no nameplate, hung in the farthest corner. Locals warn that if you stare too long into her eyes, you may find her smile changing, slowly widening, as though she already knows your fate. What if the painting wasn't of someone lost, but of someone waiting to be born? What if wedding bells rang for a bride who never arrived? One stormy night in 1887, the Holloway church stood empty, except for its heavy brass bells. At midnight, they began to toll, not once, not twice, but 13 times. Villagers rushed to the scene, believing a secret ceremony was underway. But when the doors were forced open, the pews were vacant, the altar bare, and no priest in sight. Still, the bells rang on their own, swaying as though pulled by invisible hands. The villagers whispered it was the missing Holloway bride, calling for her own wedding that never happened. After all, just days earlier, she had disappeared without a trace. Some said she had run away. Others believed she had been taken, perhaps by the same curse that stalked her family for generations. The timing was too perfect. Her disappearance, followed by bells announcing a union that could never be. Even more unsettling, every time the bells rang on their own, a Holloway daughter soon suffered tragedy. One fell ill and never recovered. Another's fiancé drowned the week before their vows. It became a grim omen. The bells did not celebrate love, they warned of doom. Families in town began to fear hearing them, covering their ears when the faint chime echoed on windless nights. A priest attempted to bless the tower, sprinkling holy water and sealing the ropes. For months, silence reigned. But one winter evening, as snow fell heavy, the bells tolled again, this time without even moving. Witnesses swore they saw the ropes hanging slack, yet the sound was deafening, shaking the rafters until cracks split the ceiling. And when the echoes finally died, another Holloway daughter had vanished. The church was abandoned soon after, its doors barred, its steeple left to rot. But travelers still claim that on misty nights, if you linger too close, the bells will toll again. Not for celebration, not for ceremony, but as a death knell for the next victim of the Holloway curse. What if the bells weren't calling for the missing bride, but summoning the next one? What if you heard footsteps at night, but no one was there? In the Holloway mansion, the grand staircase became more feared than admired. Visitors swore they heard the unmistakable sound of soft, deliberate footsteps on the stairs long after midnight, always descending, never climbing. The creak of the wood, the brushing of fabric, the faint jingle of wedding bells tied to a veil. It was as if a bride unseen was forever walking toward her fate. The legend grew darker when family members admitted that the footsteps began the night the first Holloway bride vanished. Since then, every disappearance was followed by weeks of midnight echoes, heel, toe, until the sound stopped abruptly at the front door. But when servants rushed to look, the entry remained bolted from the inside. No footprints, no wind, no intruder, just silence thick enough to strangle. One night, a young maid, determined to prove it was a trick, sat at the bottom of the staircase with a lantern. When the clock struck 12, the steps began measured, heavy, closer with each breath. The maid lifted her light and faintly saw the hem of a white dress brushing the stairs. Her scream tore through the house, and by morning she was gone. All that remained was her lantern, still burning at the foot of the steps. The Holloways tried everything, nailing boards across the staircase, chaining off the hall, even tearing up the wood. But each attempt failed. The sound returned night after night, as if the house itself remembered the missing bride and refused to let her go. Locals say the phantom was not walking down to leave the house, but walking towards someone, perhaps whoever dared to watch. Today the mansion is sealed, but trespassers claim if you press your ear to the door, you can hear it. The creak, the drag, the whisper of a veil across the steps. And if you wait too long, the sound doesn't stay on the staircase. It moves closer, across the floorboards, straight to where you're standing. What if the footsteps weren't hers, but someone following right behind her? What if every time you looked at a painting, someone inside disappeared? Among the Holloway heirlooms, one object terrified the family more than the staircase, the massive wedding portrait of the first vanished bride. She stood in ivory silk, bouquet in hand, with a solemn husband at her side. At first it seemed like any Victorian relic, but then the changes began. Guests whispered that the bride's eyes followed them across the room, unblinking, heavy with sorrow. The true horror came when her figure began to fade, first the bouquet, then her veil, then her smile. Within months, her entire form had paled into near invisibility. But the curse did not stop there. Each time another bride disappeared from the Holloway mansion, the portrait shifted again. A faint new figure, barely a shadow, appeared beside the fatting bride, as though the canvas was swallowing each victim whole. By the fifth disappearance, the once empty background was crowded with blurred silhouettes of women, veils hanging like cobwebs, faces twisted in anguish. The groom's painted expression grew darker with each addition, his smirk sharpening into a sinister grin. One night, a skeptical cousin attempted to prove it was just cracked paint. He stood before the portrait with a magnifying glass. Servants recall his final words. "It's moving, dear God, her hand is reaching out." By morning, he was gone. His glasses were found on the floor, the portrait showing yet another faint shadow behind the bride. The family covered the painting in black cloth, but even hidden, people swore they heard scratching from beneath the fabric like nails raking against canvas. When the mansion was finally abandoned, thieves tried to steal it. Every one of them vanished. The painting was never recovered. Some say it hangs in a collector's gallery, hidden from public view. Others whisper it was destroyed, but how do you destroy something that feeds on the souls it consumes? Modern rumor links the portrait to today's haunted images craze, digitized photos that seem to glitch, alter, or blink when replayed. Could the Holloway portrait have been the first case of a cursed image? And worse, what if simply looking was enough to let the curse through the frame? What if the portrait wasn't recording the victims, but trapping them alive inside? What if the ghost you feared answered you back? By the late 1800s, the Holloway curse had driven most of the family to flee, but a handful of desperate descendants stayed behind. Their nights were plagued by a ritual they couldn't escape, the knocking. It began as 3 sharp raps on the bedroom doors at midnight, always 3, always steady like a coded message. At first they ignored it, thinking it was wind or settling wood. But one brave soul, a young Holloway named Elias, decided to mock the ghost. When the knocking started, he knocked back. The house froze. Silence hung in the air like a noose. Then, slow and deliberate, came a reply. Knock, knock, knock. But this time it wasn't on the door, it came from inside his wardrobe. Elias bolted, but the knocking followed him, behind the walls, under the floorboards, inside the chimney. No matter where he ran, the ghost answered his every movement. Neighbors claimed he staggered out into the street, pale and trembling, clutching his ears. The sound, he swore, wasn't just wood on wood anymore. It was a hand, a bride's knuckles, and sometimes beneath the knocking he could hear a faint voice whispering, "Let me in." The family tried prayers, charms, even bricking up entire rooms, but the knocking bled through the stone. Some Holloways claimed the sound carried coded warnings, as if the vanished brides were trapped, desperate to communicate. Others believed it was no warning at all, just bait, luring the living into opening a door that should never be opened. When spiritualists were brought in to investigate, they set up seances in the mansion's dining hall. The medium asked, "Who knocks?" The room fell into darkness. Then came a deafening series of crashes, 13 knocks that shook the very table. The candles blew out, and when the light returned, one of the sitters was missing, her chair still warm, her teacup still trembling. The medium fainted, muttering the same phrase again and again. She said yes. She opened the door. To this day, ghost hunters who dare to approach the ruins of the Holloway estate bring tape recorders. And chillingly, many return with evidence. Not faint static, but crisp knocks that seem to respond in sequence. Some swear if you knock 3 times near the gates at midnight, you'll hear 3 in return, but closer. Too close. What if the knocking isn't asking to be let in, but asking to be let out? What if every meal ended with someone missing from the table? By the turn of the century, the Holloway mansion stood like a rotting monument to despair. But inside, the family clung to tradition. Every Sunday, no matter how few remained, they gathered at the great dining table for supper. At first, it was a show of strength, an attempt to defy the curse. But soon, those meals became the darkest rituals of all. The servants were the first to notice it. Each week, as the family filed in, the number of chairs never matched the number of people present. If 6 Holloways came to eat, 7 chairs would be set. If 8 attended, 9 would wait. And at the head of the table, an empty high-backed chair always stood, its cushion indented, as if someone invisible had already taken their seat. At first, the family laughed it off. But then something terrifying began. Whenever a chair appeared without a body to fill it, by the end of the night, that chair's owner would vanish. A father would step outside for a smoke and never return. A cousin would excuse herself to fetch wine, but the cellar would be empty. Only the chair remained, cold and waiting. The pattern grew impossible to deny. The Holloways started skipping meals, locking themselves in their rooms. But even then, the table set itself. Plates rattled into place. Forks clinked against china. The smell of roasted meat filled the hall, though no food was ever cooked. And always the chairs creaked under invisible weight, as if unseen guests were feasting where the living dared not sit. One survivor described her final meal before abandoning the mansion. She swore she saw them, faint silhouettes of veiled brides, seated in the extra chairs, lifting invisible goblets in a mockery of a toast. Their lips moved, but no sound came. The living Holloways sat paralyzed, too terrified to breathe, until the youngest son screamed. His chair toppled back empty, and he was gone before it hit the floor. Modern paranormal researchers call it the Feast of Empty Chairs, a haunting that echoes power, greed, and consumption. Some draw parallels to today's dynasties, where unseen forces, corporations, governments, family legacies, devour their heirs in silence. The Holloway's table, they argue, was nothing more than history's cruelest reminder. The dead always demand their share. What if the empty chair at the table is waiting for you? What if your bloodline guaranteed your death? By the early 1900s, the Holloway family was nearly extinct. Generations of vanished brides, heirs swallowed by shadows, and endless midnight horrors had thinned the bloodline to a single figure, Thomas Holloway, the last surviving son. From childhood, Thomas lived under the weight of whispers. You'll be the end of us. You'll be the last. Servants avoided his gaze, relatives distanced themselves, and the townsfolk crossed the street when he passed. To them, Thomas wasn't a boy. He was a living curse. As he grew, Thomas became desperate to outrun his family's fate. He refused marriage, terrified of condemning another bride to vanish. He tried leaving the mansion, sailing overseas, even changing his name. But wherever he went, the curse followed. In London, he woke to footsteps circling his bed. In Paris, his hotel mirror fogged with words, "You are next." On a train through the Alps, passengers swore an invisible woman in a veil walked the aisle behind him, never blinking, never breaking stride. By 30, Thomas was a hollow man, gaunt and paranoid, muttering to himself that he wasn't cursed, he was chosen. He began recording his experiences in a series of journals, writing of shadow brides he saw standing behind strangers, their faces pale, their hands brushing unseen against shoulders. He claimed the Holloway curse wasn't about his family at all. It was a parasite, spreading through time, feeding on fear, using his bloodline as its anchor. The last journal entry is the most chilling. Thomas wrote, "I hear them now, not just behind the walls, but inside my chest. Every heartbeat is a knock. Every breath is a vow. Tonight I do not run. Tonight I take my place." The next morning, his London boarding house room was found locked from the inside. No trace of Thomas remained. Only his clothes were neatly folded on the bed, and beside them, a bridal veil draped like a shroud. His journals ended abruptly, but some pages were ripped out, as though someone or something didn't want his final words read. Modern conspiracy theorists obsess over his missing journals, claiming they reveal a blueprint of how the curse spreads. Some believe descendants of distant Holloway cousins still walk among us, unaware of the doom in their blood. Others think the curse was never confined to the Holloways at all, that Thomas was right, and the shadow brides are already here, watching families everywhere. What if the Holloway curse didn't end with Thomas, but began with him? What if a bride could curse the living, without ever saying "I do"? The Holloway curse, locals whispered, began not with a marriage, but with a wedding that never took place. Long before the disappearances, long before the footsteps on the stairs, there was Eleanor Vance, a young woman promised to the first Holloway heir. On the morning of their wedding, she was left waiting at the altar, humiliated before the town, while her groom celebrated elsewhere. Heartbroken, Eleanor vanished into the woods in her gown, never seen alive again. But according to legend, Eleanor did not die quietly. That night, thunder cracked across the sky, rattling the Holloway mansion. Servants swore they heard a woman's sobs echo through the halls, followed by a vow repeated over and over: "No bride shall find peace. Here no Holloway shall know love." By morning, Eleanor's body was found in the river, veil wrapped around her throat. Some said it was suicide. Others believed she had been dragged there, her life stolen not by despair, but by something darker she had summoned. From that day forward, every Holloway bride walked into her wedding under Eleanor's shadow. Those who vanished weren't random victims. They were offerings, claimed by a promise sealed in betrayal. The missing portraits, the footsteps, the endless knocking, each was Eleanor's way of collecting her due. She had been denied a wedding, so she turned every Holloway union into a funeral. When spiritualists revisited the tale in the 1920s, they traced the curse back to Eleanor's unfinished vow. One medium claimed her spirit wasn't haunting the mansion at all. It was inside the bloodline, feeding off every Holloway who dared marry, growing stronger with each disappearance. The seance ended in terror when the table split down the middle and the word bride appeared carved into the wood. Modern historians debate whether Eleanor existed at all or if she was an invention, a scapegoat for the Holloways' own cruelty and misfortune. Yet the legend persists. To this day, locals whisper her name before weddings, afraid she will hear and turn her gaze upon the bride. And here's the darkest question of all. If Eleanor's vow still lingers, how many other families might be bound by curses born from broken promises, betrayals, and unspoken rage? What if the Holloway curse didn't end with the last heir, but waits, silently, for another wedding to begin? What if fire couldn't kill a curse, but set it free? In 1924, the Holloway mansion finally met its fate, not by decay, but by flame. Locals still argue over how it started. Some say lightning struck the roof during a storm. Others swear they saw a veiled woman drifting through the windows hours before the blaze, her lantern dripping sparks instead of light. Whatever the cause, by midnight, the Holloway estate was engulfed in roaring fire. But here, where the story turns chilling, witnesses claim the fire did not consume the house like a normal blaze. Instead, it spread room by room as though guided. First the bridal chambers, then the portrait hall, then the dining room where the feast of empty chairs had taken place. Each section burned in precise sequence, like a ritual being performed. The air filled not just with smoke, but with the unmistakable sound of church bells tolling, a wedding march played in reverse. Crowds gathered at a safe distance, horrified as the flames shaped themselves into human forms. Silhouettes of brides danced in the windows, veils twisting in the smoke, their screams rising above the crackle of fire. Yet among the shrieks, some swore they heard laughter, the mocking, triumphant sound of a vow finally fulfilled. When dawn came, only the stone foundations remained. But in the ashes, investigators found something impossible. Not charred beams, not melted silver wedding rings. Dozens of them scattered across the ruins, each belonging to one of the vanished Holloway brides. Some rings were centuries old, yet unmarked by fire. No bodies were ever recovered. No trace of the missing was explained. Instead of ending the curse, the fire seemed to release it. In the weeks after the blaze, townsfolk reported strange occurrences. Veiled women appearing in mirrors, phantom knocking on doors at night, bridal veils drifting across riverbanks. One newlywed couple even fled town after the bride awoke to find her veil tied around her throat. To this day, skeptics dismiss the Holloway fire as a tragic accident, but believers call it the wedding inferno, the night when the curse leapt from the mansion into the world beyond. And if the curse was no longer bound to stone walls, then perhaps it has no bounds at all. What if burning the mansion wasn't a desperate attempt to destroy the curse, but the ritual the curse needed to spread everywhere? What if the Holloway curse didn't die in the fire, but lives in us now? The Holloway mansion may have burned to ash, but the curse did not vanish with the flames, it evolved. For decades after, people across the region reported terrifying encounters that felt eerily familiar. Newlyweds vanishing on their wedding nights, photographs where the bride's face blurred into a ghostly veil, midnight footsteps echoing in homes far from the ruins. It was as if Eleanor's vow had slipped its chains, no longer tied to one family, but stalking anyone daring to promise forever. Paranormal investigators pieced together a disturbing pattern. Every 50 years, spikes of disappearances aligned with anniversaries of the Holloway fire. Brides, grooms, and even guests vanished without explanation. In one chilling case from the 1970s, an entire wedding party was found outside a church at dawn, tables still set, food untouched, chairs overturned. But every bride and groom in attendance was gone. Only the rings remained, scattered in the grass, glinting like the Holloway ashes. Some believe the curse became viral, passed not through blood but through memory. The story itself is the infection. To hear it is to invite it. To repeat it is to spread it. Like a shadow stitched into language, Aliner's vow now travels from mouth to mouth, from screen to screen. And every time it's told, her reach grows wider. Think about it. How many modern, haunted weddings, cursed photos, or vanishing brides have made headlines in the last century? Are they just tragedies or echoes of the Holloways still feeding? Could this very story be the doorway she needed, the reason you feel that chill on your neck right now? The Holloways are gone. Their mansion is gone, but the curse is eternal. It waits at the edge of every vow, every kiss sealed at the altar, every promise spoken under trembling chandeliers. And maybe, just maybe, it waits for you. What if by listening to this tale, you've already invited the bride into your house, and she's standing behind you, veil in hand, waiting for your answer?